You ever look at history, all the chaos, and just wonder, is there some kind of pattern here? A secret code under all the noise? And what if unlocking that code isn't about seeing the future, but about, well, seeing ourselves? Okay, let's get into it.
So, our whole journey tonight kicks off with this really interesting observation. It's a classic piece of pattern recognition, right? Someone's looking at all this stuff happening around the 1500s, and they connect the dots to this specific bit of prophecy, the little season. You know, the supposed time when deception just gets unleashed on the world. And that's our hook. That's the thread we're going to pull on.
And look, this isn't just some abstract theory. It's tied to some very real, very tragic history. When you zoom out and look across the centuries, this deeply disturbing pattern starts to pop out. We're talking about the repeated expulsion of Jewish communities from one European nation after another. First England, then France, Spain, Portugal, all these German states. It's just this relentless, tragic wave.
So when you see a pattern like that, laid out so clearly, you have to ask, right? Is this just a bunch of terrible coincidences? You know, each one driven by its own local drama? Or is it a sign of something bigger? A single, hidden power at work, like that original theory suggests? Because how we answer that, well, it changes everything.
Okay, so before we just jump on board with a theory, especially one as loaded as this one, we've got to stress test it, right? We need to be investigators here, not just followers. So let's really dig in and see if it holds up.
But here's the thing. The moment you start looking at what the actual historians say, that whole single hidden power idea, it just kind of falls apart. It turns out each of these events had its own messy local reasons. You had kings who wanted to confiscate wealth, local politics where people wanted to get out of their debts, merchant guilds trying to crush the competition. You had scapegoating during plagues, and of course, just plain old religious and ethnic hatred. So yeah, it's a pattern, but it's a pattern of similar human failings, not some grand conspiracy.
And this is maybe the most important takeaway of the whole thing. It's a total flip of the script. The original theory says, hey, look at this minority group getting all this hidden power. But the actual history says the complete opposite. It says, look at this majority so insecure and stressed out that it's targeting a minority. So the pattern isn't a sign of the minority's secret strength. It's a sign of the majority's weakness and fear.
And the problems don't stop there. When you actually try to map these events onto the prophecy, it's like trying to force puzzle pieces together that just don't fit. For one, the timeline doesn't really line up with what scholars say. The prophecy talks about a worldwide deception, not kicking out one specific group of people. And that phrase, synagogue of Satan, historically that was a very specific term for a local conflict back in the 1st century. It wasn't meant to be a label for an entire ethnic group across all of history. So the whole theory just doesn't hold water.
And this is where we have to be really, really clear. There's a real danger here. Taking these old, symbolic, apocalyptic labels and slapping them onto actual living groups of people, well, that has a really dark history. It's not just inaccurate, it's a way of thinking that has caused immense harm. It's a dead end, both intellectually and ethically.
So what do? Just toss the whole idea in the bin? No, not at all. What if the problem isn't the prophecy, but how we're reading it? Maybe we need a safer, and honestly a much deeper way to look at these symbols. Instead of trying to map them literally onto history, what if we map them onto psychology? Let's try redefining our terms and see what happens. Okay, first up, the little season. Instead of seeing it as some group rising to power, let's think of it as an entire era of chaos and fragmentation. I mean, think about what happens after 1500. You've got the Reformation, the birth of modern countries, all these new philosophies clashing with each other. It's like a single solid worldview just shatters into a million tiny pieces.
All right, next, synagogue of Satan. Let's take that label and completely detach it from any specific group of people. What if it's just a symbol? A symbol for any powerful institution, a church, a government, a giant corporation that talks a big game about truth and justice, but behind the scenes, it's all about deception and control. We can all think of a few of those, right?
And here's the big one, the most powerful shift in perspective. What if the Satan in this story isn't some guy with horns and a pitchfork? What if it's a symbol for something inside all of us? The human ego. You know, that part of us that's driven by fear, that has to be right all the time, that loves to divide the world into us versus them. The part that will do anything to protect itself. Now, when you use these new definitions, the book of Revelation completely transforms. It stops being some weird fortune-telling book about the future, and it becomes a map of our own minds, a map of our collective psychology.
It becomes the story of the ego's journey, how it creates illusions, the damage it causes, and how it eventually falls apart.
And the whole process starts with the 7 seals. Think of this as the Great Awakening, where we start to see how broken our thinking is. First, you see your own self-righteousness. Then your love of conflict and division. You see how you're always thinking in terms of scarcity. Then you see how our systems are literally built on death. You're forced to face injustice head-on, and your whole world feels like it's shaking. And at the end of all that, there's just silence. You're just stunned, realizing how deep the problem really goes.
So after that inner awakening comes the outer consequences. That's the 7 trumpets. This is what an ego-driven world actually looks like when it plays out. We're talking ecological breakdown, the violence of colonialism, industrial pollution choking the planet, this massive loss of meaning and purpose, and of course, the absolute horror of world wars. It's basically the bill coming due for letting the ego run the show for so long.
And according to this symbolic map, that's where we are. Right now, we're living in the age of the consequences. The trumpets have sounded. You can see it in our history. You can see it in the news every single day. The damage is done, and it puts us at this incredible turning point, right on the edge between the total crisis and whatever comes next.
The final act is the 7 bowls. This is the total collapse of the ego. It's like a purification process. Our obsession with stuff just stops working. The suffering we all experience starts to connect us instead of dividing us. The old ways of finding meaning feel empty. The raw truth burns away all our favorite illusions. Corrupt systems of power just crumble, and all those walls we build between each other, they start to dissolve, until finally we reach a new way of being. It is done.
So what we end up with is this completely new kind of line. It's not about predicting the future. It's about mapping our own psychological and spiritual journey. And the beauty of it is, it's a model that lets us make sense of history without needing a villain, without having to scapegoat anyone.
And you can really see it as 2 big ages. First, you have the millennium, from about 500 to 1500 AD. That was a time with a more unified worldview, where the ego was kind of kept in check by tradition and shared beliefs. But then, around 1500, the little season kicks off. The ego is unleashed, everything fragments, and you get this explosion of competing ideas and propaganda on an industrial scale.
Which brings us right back to today. If we really are in the late stages of this little season, this age of ego and deception, you have to wonder, what could possibly end it?
Well, the answer might be technology. Kind of weird, right? But think about it. For most of history, information just disappeared. It decayed. Right now, we're drowning in propaganda, but what if the next stage is something totally different? What if tech like AI gives us a world with a perfect, unchangeable memory? An archive that can't be edited? A world where you just can't lie about what happened?
And that could be the thing that finally ends the little season. A world where deception on a grand scale just doesn't work anymore. Where propaganda and all the self-serving stories the ego tells itself just wither under the bright light of perfect, total transparency. So here's the final thought, the big question I want to leave you with. If the ego, this symbolic Satan we've been talking about, if its lifeblood is deception, secrets, and making us forget the past, what happens to it in an age of perfect memory? How can it possibly survive in a world that is starting to remember everything?